Immortals of Aveum released at a really bad time. For whatever reason, the developers at Ascendant Studios and the publishers at EA Originals thought it would be a good idea to release the game during the same time frame where the gaming world was gearing up for titles such as Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield, which released literally just 2 weeks later on September 6th. Not only that, in that same week, it had some competition with Armored Core 6 dropping just days later. It really felt like this game was given a death sentence with that release window and a price tag of $69.99. Nearly a year later now, and I decided to finally jump in and do a full playthrough of the game with the goal of giving you an idea of what the game is like and whether or not it's worth it. Real quick, before I actually jump into this review, I'd like to do a quick self-promo. On this channel, I like to review all types of games, new and old, so if you're into that type of content with in-depth reviews, please feel free to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. Let's get into it. So before jumping into the depths of the game, I want to first give a bit of history on the developers because I find that's a pretty good way to get an understanding of what they're capable of. In this scenario, however, it doesn't really apply much because Immortals of Aveum is Ascendant Studios' first title. But they do have some experienced industry veterans, with some of their staff being made up of former Telltale game devs, which went bankrupt back in 2018, and also the former creative director of Sledgehammer Games, Brett Robbins, who founded the studio in partnership with EA. So let's get a better understanding of Immortals of Aveum. What the heck is it? What do you do in it? In my opinion, Immortals of Aveum is a first-person shooter / action game. In it, you play the role of Jack, a nobody pickpocket who basically ascends to being an immortal within the first few hours of the game. Your role as Jack is to help the Light's army overcome the Everwar that has been taking place for years. Throughout your journey in Aveum, you'll meet a huge cast of characters, wield various spells, unlock loot, upgrade your skills, all to tailor your build to help put an end to the Everwar. So let's move on to the story of Immortals of Aveum. I won't spoil anything in this particular section, but more so talk about the quality. And I think one thing that surprised me most about Immortals of Aveum is its storytelling and lore. Ascendant Studios have built a completely original world here, and there's quite a bit to it. Journals and notes are scattered around the world of Aveum to give you a better understanding of the history, the politics, and the current state of everything. And as Jack, your journey basically starts from being someone who knows very little as to what's at stake, to gaining a deep understanding of all the various parts that are involved within the Everwar and how you play a role in it. Immortals of Aveum's story isn't gonna grip you to the edge of your seat, but it's also one that's not just phoned in. There's some good lore here, and a lot of the information can be gained from talking to NPCs, and while there isn't really choices to make that will affect the story in any way, it was still good enough to keep me entertained. The game is voiced by a cast of a few recognizable actors that you may have seen in movie or TV, and the overall quality of the voice acting is rock solid. The writing, however, does have that Marvel comedic timing or banter that a lot of people have started to point out in game trailers these days as a negative, so if that's something that bothers you, I'd probably steer clear of this game. Let's move on to what's most important in my opinion, the gameplay. Immortals of Aveum at its very core is a first-person shooter. If you strip away all the fancy magic and spells, you're left with a very basic FPS. Immortals of Aveum brings in its own unique twist to the genre by being a magic FPS. If I had to call it something, it would be that. To give you a better sense of what to expect before diving deeper into the various systems, I'd say this game's closest comparison would likely be Doom Eternal, but with that comparison made, let's actually start digging more deep into this game in particular. So as Jack, you're able to wield from 3 schools of magic, which in the world of Aveum makes you a Triarch, which is basically like a jack of all trades but a master of none type magic wielder. You start out with some basic attacks that are initiated with the right trigger, and depending on the current sigil you're using, whether green, blue, or red, your attack will differ. So for example, if you're using a blue sigil, these attacks will be more like a semi-automatic rifle or a sniper of some sorts. They are straight, accurate line drives, and they deal some good damage at long range. If you're using the green sigil, your attacks will be much faster. Kind of like an SMG, your attacks will be rapid fire. If you're using a red sigil, your attacks will feel more like a shotgun, and close range is the name of the game when that is active. But there is more. So your sigil attacks will vary depending on the type of gauntlet you have equipped. For example, I had a green gauntlet that changed my SMG like rapid fire spray to a homing missile of some sort. I also had a red gauntlet that changed my shotgun blast to something more similar to a rocket launcher. So gear does come into play in the types of attacks you make, but I'll do a deep dive into loot a little bit later because I'll admit I am a loot goblin and it's always one of my favorite parts of any game when it's done well. So far we've covered the basic attacks, but that's not it. In addition to basic attacks, you also have Furies, which are big time spells that cost mana. These Furies are a huge part of the combat, as some enemies will demand that a certain type of Fury be used to whittle down a shield. As I mentioned, these do cost mana, but are generally very useful when needing to clear a group of enemies, break a shield, or even melee an enemy to death. That covers just the basics of gameplay, and this is essentially what Immortals of Aveum builds on throughout your journey. You'll gain new spells, and you also gain some loot that will augment either the behavior of certain spells or improve on them in a different way. Combat in Immortals of Aveum hinges its complexity on this Triarch system. You'll encounter enemies who essentially will only ever be damaged if they're being hit with a certain magic type. This is very easy to identify during gameplay. For example, if you see an enemy who shoots red stuff or has a red shield, then use your red gauntlet. If they're green, then use the green, so on and so forth. It's worth noting that not every enemy in the game will only have a certain type of damage that affects them. Most enemies outside of few mob types can be damaged with your best weapon. Also, as part of your arsenal, you have various augments. These are another layer in gameplay that are either used to interact with the world or designed to be used in combat. I'll first talk about the blink ability, but I won't go through all abilities, only the important ones. So the blink ability is basically a dash that will use a cooldown before being active again. You also have your shield, which is useful for absorbing damage. I use this quite a lot during my playthrough. You also have a grapple, which is used in combat arenas, but for the most part is used for traversal. And then you also have this disrupt spell, which basically is a way to stun an enemy who's preparing to cast a spell. These are just a few of them. I'll cover the rest of them in a later section specific to the world of Aveum. So I want to make a quick note on enemy variety. There is a decent amount of enemy variety in Immortals of Aveum, but nothing to really write home about. About a third through the game, you'll have seen every enemy type there is, and they'll often be a variation of an existing enemy type that you've already encountered. Most bosses you encounter early game will become a regular enemy later on, but they're usually a lot tougher to kill with a bigger health pool. So my second favorite part of any game is usually the loot, and Immortals of Aveum does a decent job here. So as Jack, you're equipped with 3 sigils, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 blue. You also have 3 totems, 2 rings, and a pair of bracers, all which help tell your build a bit more. Now the loot in Aveum comes in 4 different tiers. You have your common, rare, epic, and legendary, each kind of building on the previous tier by increasing its damage or some other stats and introducing more modifiers. For example, this was my loadout at a certain point of the game, and I was nearly fully loaded with legendaries, so there's a nice sense of progression as you make your way through the game and the loot drops become more and more rare. The game doesn't have any RNG from what I can tell. Each piece of equipment is pre-made and its stats are predetermined, but that's fine because this game isn't really a looter shooter by any means, and I still think it does a decent job of introducing build variety based on gear. You also have an option to craft gear, and this usually costs some money and a certain type of essence. So if you're trying to craft a red sigil, it'll cost some gold, and also red essence, which is a resource gathered through the world in chests and also from enemies. Aside from that, you can also upgrade existing gear, and this usually will upgrade one of its base stats as well as its modifiers, but I was hoping the upgrades would be more impactful. However, the game seems to be very tightly balanced, and you won't be making any game-breaking builds from what I can tell. And then finally, you can deconstruct your existing gear or gear that you're no longer using, which will give you back some gold and essence. I think going from loot to skills is a perfect segue, so let's jump into the skill system in Immortals of Aveum. Talents are essentially skill paths that you can take to become stronger in a certain school of magic or augment your existing abilities in some form or fashion. Let's just dig into this red tree to start out so you can get a better idea of what we got going on here. As you level up in Immortals of Aveum, you gain ascensions. These are points that are used within these talent trees. Nodes in these talent trees often increase your damage for a certain magic type, increase armor, decrease reload speed, but these trees also include some specialization. For example, this ability specific section would augment my blast wave to inflict corrosion. Another point into it would increase my range and knockback by 40%, and the last tier would create a fissure that damages and detonates after some time. So again, you can tailor your talents and abilities to your liking, and play more focused on a certain school of magic. The route I took was not to just focus on one tree, but I spread my talent points across all three. Now, this is not the most in-depth system, but it doesn't feel tacked on. Sure, some of the nodes only increase a certain stat, but the ability-specific nodes are a welcome addition and help add to the overall choice that a player has. So with the gameplay wrapped up, let's dive into the world of Aveum. Immortals of Aveum is by no means an open world game. Instead, you'll find areas that sometimes have different side pockets of smaller areas that contain a hidden chest behind a puzzle, but there isn't much more than that, to be honest. There aren't any really sprawling areas. The existing ones are pretty much carved out, and the map menu does a good job of highlighting what's there. That is not a knock on the game by any means. In fact, the reason I pulled this game out of my backlog to review was because I was sick of big open world games and wanted something more streamlined. Throughout the world, you'll also find these side areas called Shatterfanes. These side areas transport you to a different place and usually consist of traversal puzzles or combat arenas, and the reward can be a few different things, such as a max health increase, max mana increase, or even an item. These are nice to have, but they're nothing that needs to be done or required in any way. I should mention that the game doesn't have any side quests. You won't have NPCs asking you to go do something for them for a reward. This may or may not be a good thing depending on the type of gamer you are. In my case, I didn't mind it much, but I was kind of surprised there weren't any. There are a fair amount of puzzles in the game. Most puzzles will ask you to match colors within a time frame to open a hidden door, usually leading to loot. And this is also where some of your equipment comes into play. For example, your disrupt spell that is used to interrupt enemies is also used during puzzles to shine a beam through a rock to open a door. I didn't find any of these puzzles to be difficult, so if you're coming into the game worried about the difficulty of these puzzles, I wouldn't worry. Immortals of Aveum is a good looking game no matter how you slice it. The cutscenes look good, the lip syncing, facial animations are some of the industry best, the magic effects also look good, and the game gives you a good indication of what an Unreal Engine 5 game looks like. Graphically, the game does very well. Performance, however, is a whole nother story. The game just does not run well on PS5, it simply does not. The resolution is never clear at all. It was blurry a lot of the times. Switching sigils has this weird artifacting thing going on with it, and there were constant frame drops. I found the game to just be bad performance-wise in general, which to be honest, wasn't surprising because it's a really demanding game with lots going on at any given time on the screen, but if you're looking for a smooth experience, look elsewhere. Since the game has came out, the devs have tried to make the game run better on consoles, but there really doesn't seem to be much progress. In one of the most recent updates, they added in AMD FSR 3, which in my opinion does not help at all. Not only that, it introduces this weird jittering when there's a transparent box around a mission objective or dialogue. There's really no other way to put it, but nearly a year later and the performance is still subpar. So let's talk about some of the updates Immortals of Aveum has had since launch. And there's been a variety of them. Most of them have been bug fixes or an attempt to make the resolution or performance better, but there are also some good additions. They also added a new Game Plus mode, which basically you can restart the game and keep all your progression, and they also added a Grand Magnus difficulty, which is basically the hardest difficulty you can play the game on. So let me wrap this up and give my final thoughts. Immortals of Aveum is a fun game. It's flat out a fun time, and to me, the combat never got old. The stream of upgrades and loot kept me engaged as well, and the story, while not great, still was able to keep me interested to the end. The game took me around 13 hours to complete the main story, and if you were to do all the side content like the Shatterfanes and collectibles, I can see this taking closer to 20-ish hours. The downside of the game is the performance. It just does not run well on console. I personally cannot speak to PC performance as I played this on my PS5. As I mentioned previously, if you're looking for a game to run smoothly, this one isn't it. At the beginning of my review, I mentioned that the game was given a death sentence on its release by being priced at $69.99 and releasing within the same window as some other major titles. These days, the game is often on sale, and if you're looking for a 12 to 15 hour blockbuster type movie game, then I would definitely recommend giving this a shot as long as you find it on sale and are willing to deal with a shoddy performance. So that's going to wrap up my review of Immortals of Aveum. If you enjoyed that, please feel free to check out some of my other reviews where I went back and revisited Greedfall, Dead Island 2, and Atlas Fallen. Please feel free to leave any comments of any games you would like me to go back and review, whether new or old. I'd be happy to look through them. Thank you guys for watching as always. Feel free to subscribe to this channel if you're new here, and I will see you guys in the next one.